Starting in April of 2007, I went out on a mission to answer a simple question. What is the difference between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder? And now, finally, after almost 3 years of research, thousands of emails and comments, and 20 consecutive slideshow videos on this subject alone, I can finally share with you my definitive answer. And that answer is that I've been asking the wrong question. However, as you'll see, by figuring out that I was asking the wrong question, I eventually stumbled upon the right one. And with that, I think I've come across an absolute breakthrough with regards to how, as a society, we view both bipolar disorder and spiritual experiences. A breakthrough that could eventually lead to the healing of thousands of people, not only from bipolar disorder, but from schizophrenia and many other mental disorders. So what this video is really about is how I went from asking the wrong question to asking the right one. You see, before I knew anything about bipolar disorder, I had searched for a clinical understanding of my own spiritual awakening shortly after it happened about 10 years ago. It was then that I discovered the work of Dr. Stan Grof, and for Grof, there was a condition that looked very much like mental illness, but could actually lead to a spiritual breakthrough, which is what I had, and he called this condition a spiritual emergency. In reading his book, The Stormy Search for the Self, I finally found some validation for my spiritual experience, something that few others were willing to believe, that what I had been through was indeed spiritual and not a mental illness. And in the back of this book, he had an appendix to help people determine the difference between a mental illness like schizophrenia and a true spiritual emergency. So here are some of the criteria for a spiritual emergency. First, exams show no pathology or disease affecting the brain. The intellect and memory are challenged but intact. Adequate pre-episode social functioning and healthy relationships. Enough trust to be able to communicate and cooperate with others during the episode. And conversely, there should be an absence of self-destructive behavior, aggressive behavior, or withdrawal from help. The person in a spiritual emergency could also have the feeling that something important, healing, and even spiritual is happening. Spiritual themes such as birth and death are also present in an experience of spiritual emergency. And so, because my experience met all of Grof's criteria, I went for over a decade thinking that my experience and that of people with mental illness were completely different. However, when my niece Anna had an experience in 2007, I was struck by how similar it was to my own and became convinced that she was having a spiritual emergency, even though her psychiatrist was medicating her for what he saw as a mental illness, most likely bipolar disorder. It was then that I started this research project as well as making YouTube videos to share my story. Once the comments started rolling in, I realized that thousands of people labeled with bipolar disorder had stories similar to my own and fit Grof's criteria for a spiritual emergency. And not only that, but once I started producing theory videos explaining what actually happens to someone when they're in a spiritual emergency, I realized that many of us were going through the same deeply spiritual themes while we were in this apparent insanity. Both a spiritual emergency and bipolar mania can have a feeling of cosmic oneness to it, a feeling of timelessness. You may feel you have all-knowing universal knowledge or a deep sense of sacredness. There can be spiritual visions or voices, or as psychiatrists call them, hallucinations. You may think that you're dreaming or in a movie, that you're being tested by God, that you're the Messiah, a prophet, or a saint, or that you're dead, dying, or being reborn. And these are just a few of the very common spiritual experiences that many bipolar people identified with in my videos. However, some bipolar people did not identify with these experiences at all. Not only did these people hate my videos, but they also hated me for making them. What is so spiritual about wanting to kill my cats? One guy asked me. You're going to have to answer to Jesus for this, said one woman. Apparently, for some people, bipolar mania had been almost an anti-spiritual experience. Some people suffered from very demonic hallucinations. Others endured severe paranoia or deep feelings of anger. For me, these people seem to be encountering experiences that I'd always considered to be closer to schizophrenia. But perhaps what was most common was not these highly positive spiritual experiences or the deeply fearful, painful experience. No, what was most common was a mixed episode. Most people would experience both ends of the spectrum, the love and the fear, the joy and the pain, the good and the evil. It seemed to me that rather than being a separation between spiritual emergencies and bipolar disorder, there was a spectrum of experiences from those dominated by love to those dominated by fear, with most people having a type of mixed episode which would lie somewhere in the middle, a mix of love and fear. And not only that, but this spectrum would go from spiritual emergencies to bipolar disorder all the way to schizophrenia, with no definitive break between the three. And so it's in this way that I became convinced that three experiences which I was sure were completely separate from each other were actually all part of the same spectrum of experience. And that's when I realized that my original question was going nowhere, because I was never going to find a clear, distinct line between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder. But it was in realizing that I needed to change direction that I went from asking the wrong question to asking the right one. And that question is, if experiences of spiritual emergency, bipolar mania, and schizophrenia are all part of the same spectrum, then what are the key factors which would lead to someone having a more positive, negative, or mixed episode of psychosis? And it's that question that I intend to answer in part 2 of this video. Now, as luck would have it, back during the time I was studying Stan Grof's stuff, I was also studying Ken Wilber. And it's with Wilber that I learned about another type of spectrum, what he called the spectrum of consciousness. And as it turns out, just as people in psychosis have experiences ranging from the very fearful to the very loving, according to Wilber, we actually evolve from more closed, fearful levels of consciousness to more open, loving levels of consciousness. And so, in recognizing this parallel between the spectrum of psychosis and the spectrum of consciousness, I started to wonder if they would somehow match up. Meaning, would people at a higher, more loving level of consciousness have more spiritual emergency type of psychosis? Would the people at the lower levels have more fearful, schizophrenic type psychosis? And most importantly, would the people in the middle have more mixed episodes, the typical type of bipolar psychosis? Now, in order to see if this theory had any useful value to it, the toughest part for me was going to be determining if schizophrenia was connected to the lowest levels of consciousness. And this was mainly because I didn't have a lot of contact with people who had severe schizophrenia, the type of people who might spend many months or years in psychiatric institutions. However, after a few years of research and a lot of reading, I did find that there are a number of similarities between the way people at lower levels of consciousness think and the way people with schizophrenia think. Now, along with the very fearful life experience that I've already talked about, probably the most obvious and important similarity is that both groups have hallucinations. In fact, there's a very interesting book by a guy named Julian Jaynes called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And in this book, he explains how people, not only at the tribal level of consciousness, but also at the earliest levels of civilization, people in the feudal level, were not directed by their own mind, but by the commanding visions and voices of the gods. In fact, visions and voices were common in ancient Egypt, Greece, India, and among tribal peoples around the world. Proof of the commonplace nature of these occurrences can be found in the earliest books of the Old Testament, parts of the Greek Iliad, and the Hindu Vedas as well. In fact, hallucinations were so pervasive in these more primitive civilizations that Jaynes writes, according to our theory, we could say that before the second millennium BC, everyone was schizophrenic. And just like with primitive peoples, when someone with schizophrenia has a hallucination, they interpret that vision or voice concretely, never symbolically. So that angel that they see or hear appears to them as real as the hand in front of your face. And because of this concrete way of interpreting reality, when people at these levels have a God experience, it's very common for them to think that they are the exact reincarnation of Jesus Christ, having power over others. Now, I know this may seem highly irrational, but you need to understand that in both groups, reality is seen as an entirely magical place. Because, as I explained in my videos on tribal consciousness, the inner world and the outer world are fused together, making both schizophrenics and tribal people highly superstitious. And so with a mind that works like this, it's no wonder that both groups have a deep fear and respect for evil spirits, devils, and demons. It truly is a mind where any fears that you have are brought to life. So overall, whether someone is at a lower level of consciousness or they're suffering from schizophrenia, we're really seeing someone who's living in their own world, someone who sees the world from one perspective. The movie The Soloist, starring Jamie Foxx and Robert Downey Jr., gives a very honest look at how isolated this one perspective reality can be. There, Fox plays a former musician who now lives in a world of shadows and potential threats due to his schizophrenia. And as you'll see, the one perspective reality makes it very difficult for him to maintain any relationships because it's almost impossible for him to consider other people's thoughts and feelings when he makes decisions or takes action. So, considering all of these similarities, I think it's safe to say that we've got a clear connection between the type of psychosis associated with schizophrenia and the lower levels of consciousness. Now, the question was, would I find a similar relationship at the higher end of the spectrum? Well, to start, the Power of Now level and the postmodern level are the most open, loving levels of consciousness in the model. These levels also have a much more spiritual but non-religious view of life, which parallels the insistence of many people in spiritual emergencies that they're in fact going through a spiritual experience. These are also the most intuitive levels of consciousness, where people often override their purely rational, logical thinking and trust their intuitive feeling for things instead. And this ties in with the intuitive interpretation that people give when they're having a spiritual emergency, that they're going through something very important, some inexplicable inner process which must be completed. Both groups also see reality as being deeply meaningful on a symbolic level. They will think, wow, this looks like a hotel, but it feels like purgatory. Or he looks like a security guard, but he seems like an angel. As a result, rather than being bombarded with the disturbing concrete thoughts and hallucinations of schizophrenia, people in a spiritual emergency are often quite pleasantly surprised by startling synchronicities, especially receiving messages from the television, music, or other symbolic communications which seem specifically designed for them. But of course, as people at the higher levels of consciousness know, synchronicities aren't just for people that are in experiences of psychosis. Many postmodern spiritual books like the Celestine Prophecy discuss the importance of synchronicities in our daily lives. Global issues such as poverty, the environment, war, or racism could all surface when somebody is in the middle of a spiritual emergency, and these are issues that increase in personal importance as you get into the higher levels of consciousness. And finally, as opposed to the one perspective thinking of schizophrenia, many people in spiritual emergencies are already thinking in a postmodern multiple perspective way of seeing things. To give one example, my favorite stories of so-called psychosis come from former atheists who open up to seeing life from different perspectives once they're hit with a powerful spiritual emergency. So once again, it appears that we have a lot of compelling evidence for connecting the more positive spiritual experiences of a spiritual emergency with the higher levels of consciousness. Okay, so what would connect the middle, traditional, and modern levels of consciousness to the type of psychosis usually diagnosed as bipolar mania? Well, based on my research, I would say that the main characteristic at this level is confusion. Being bipolar is confusing for a couple of reasons. First, like I said, you're most likely having a mixed episode. You're having experiences of love expressed through cosmic oneness, timelessness, and a sense of all-knowingness, just to give a few examples. But on the other hand, it can be very frightening as well, as many people experience moments of paranoia, even hallucinations, and regressions into trauma, which can be quite painful. And then, of course, there's the drugs, which don't help much either. For most people with bipolar disorder, drug experiences, usually with marijuana or LSD, have been a part of what triggered their first episode. So for yourself and others, it may be hard to separate the effects of the drug from the psychosis itself. Another source of confusion is simply the way people think at these levels of consciousness. You see, as we evolve from the magical, concrete lower levels to the symbolic, intuitive higher levels, the middle levels, particularly the modern level, is much more factual and logical. And as a result, any inner experiences we happen to be going through are invalidated, they're denied because they can't be measured. If you're at the modern level, everyone will have you believing that your disorder is caused by a chemical imbalance, even though the scientific evidence will show that you're biologically normal. At the traditional level, people might see you as having a moral flaw, like God is punishing you for something you did. But either way, regardless of how you felt about your experience on the other side, people at these two middle levels of consciousness will work to convince you that these experiences are bad and better off forgotten. And if you're at those middle levels, you'll probably believe them. So once again, we find a lot of compelling evidence demonstrating that a typical bipolar psychosis usually fits within the modern and traditional levels of consciousness, especially because at this stage of development, any spiritual experiences we go through are denied, first by our society, then by ourselves. Schizophrenia, bipolar mania, spiritual emergencies. The spectrum of psychosis matches seamlessly with the spectrum of consciousness. Now, just recognizing this relationship will be a huge step forward for both psychiatry and psychology. But before I explain why, I need to add one more very important factor to our model. A factor that will also help us understand why it's much easier for some people to heal from psychosis than others. And that missing factor is trauma. When diving into the ocean of your own soul, it helps to know what lies beneath the surface. Maybe that water is crystal clear, but maybe it's full of sea monsters. Now either way, it's always a hero's journey. But when you know those waters are especially dark and dangerous, it helps to know what might be in store for you. And that's why having some idea of your own degree of life trauma is especially important before you take the plunge. Now, normally most people think of trauma as related to child abuse, and that is by far the most damaging form of trauma that I've come across. However, as I talked about in my video on trauma, it can come in surprising forms. Experiences from any time in our lives can have a powerful effect on us, such as witnessing a murder or being in a fire. But we can also be affected by traumatic events which we have no conscious memory of, like being an unwanted pregnancy. But regardless of the shape these traumas take, there does seem to be a general rule, which is that the more traumatic your life experience is, the more difficult your experience on the other side will be. You see, once you're into the so-called psychosis, there is a tremendous opportunity to heal the wounds you carry from those experiences in life that you would rather forget or may have completely forgotten. However, before the healing can take place, there's a catch, and that catch is that you need to re-experience the trauma first. And that's the hard part. You see, as long as that sea monster is swimming in the deep, he's outside of your awareness, even though he's always there. In order to get rid of him, you need to let him come to the surface where you can see and feel all of his ugliness in the light of day. And it's in this process of allowing our sea monsters or our traumas to become completely conscious emotionally and intellectually that they finally disappear. Now, the good news in all of this is that during the acute psychosis, it's often possible to rid yourself of painful experiences which may have haunted you for years, and this can happen in just a matter of hours or even minutes. All that needs to take place is that you need to open yourself emotionally to what you're feeling inside, and that can be a scary thing because some of the energies connected to these traumas can be very powerful. It's not uncommon for people to be crying, screaming, or even blacking out when these experiences happen. And so for many people in this situation, sensing the emotional pain and memories arising within, it's tempting to simply try and block whatever's happening within you. Playing loud music, talking nonstop, or even doubling up on the meds. But for the true healing to take place, you really need to let go. And so because trauma is such an important factor to consider, I've added it to the model here because, as I said, all things being equal, the more trauma that is within you, the more difficult and fearful your process will be. And so that's why on the left I'm connecting heavy trauma with high fear, and on the right, light trauma with low fear. And if you take a look at my video on hallucinations, you'll see that I've already found a relationship between a heavy amount of trauma and schizophrenia. And it should come as no surprise that the people at the opposite end of the spectrum, those having the very positive spiritual experiences, had very few difficult traumas to deal with in their experience of psychosis or in their life history. Now, I'm sure there are many people out there with bipolar disorder that don't consider their lives to be particularly traumatic, and that may be the case. However, there is one other type of trapped energy which we carry within us that needs to surface when you're in a typical manic psychosis, and that is the energy of repressions. You see, as we move from the one perspective reality of the feudal level into the two perspective world of the traditional level, we learn to repress our emotions. Now, as I talked about in a previous video, learning to repress emotions is an important skill as it helps you get along with people better. However, some people become overly repressed, feeling that they can never truly be themselves. That's why I've called bipolar disorder I can't be me disorder. And based on the people I've talked to, I would say that it's the repression of your true self or inner spirit, which is often a big part of why people go into psychosis. So you see, as opposed to someone with very deep psychological problems who's perhaps had a lifetime of difficulties relating to people, many people with bipolar disorder were in fact the opposite. Top of their class, straight A students, popular and charismatic. It's just that perhaps the expectations they felt they needed to live up to may have become too much for them, or in fact didn't really reflect who they were as a person. So as opposed to being in the more traumatized lower left-hand corner of our chart, most of the people diagnosed with bipolar disorder that I've talked to would find themselves towards the upper right, dealing with some trauma but also a fair amount of emotional repression. Now, some of you might be asking, if people in the far upper right-hand corner are already at a higher level of consciousness and have less trauma or repressions to deal with than others, then why would they enter into a psychosis at all? Well, starting with the modern level of consciousness, we begin to question our own reality. And at first, we challenge the thinking of our culture, questioning our religious beliefs, cultural obligations, or even superstitions that might be left over from the lower levels. But at the postmodern level, we begin to question everything, even our own rational mind. Here, the world somehow opens up and the sense of wonder we had as children returns, especially as we begin to see how our own thoughts, feelings, and attitudes directly impact or even help create our own reality. And so in order to create a better world for themselves, people become much more introspective at the postmodern level, questioning the limitations of their own consciousness in order for them to improve. As a result, people in or near the postmodern level are often enthusiastically involved in activities which, whether they know it or not, put them on a course for breaking out of their own ego or false self, and possibly into a very positive spiritual psychosis or spiritual emergency. Now, these activities may include intensive self-help seminars, spiritual retreats. Reading a very inspiring book could be a trigger, or even foreign travel in the name of finding yourself. Pretty much any highly stimulating, thought-provoking activity could be part of the ego-breaking triggers that takes you into psychosis, including watching videos from Bipolar or Waking Up. Now, are traumas and repression still a factor here? Sure they are. It's just that for those in the upper right, the psychosis they find themselves in is often caused, quite accidentally, by their own efforts to expand their level of consciousness. And this brings me to another interesting aspect of this model, because based on the people I've talked to, it seems to me that when it comes to the life circumstances or triggers which cause someone to go into their first psychosis, the people in the upper right usually have many triggers happening, while those in the lower left have few, if any. For example, a typical upper right bipolar psychosis involves moving away to university. The combination of a new school in a new city, being away from family and old friends, being introduced to new ideas, and then maybe seeing your grades drop, plus smoking a lot of marijuana. This combination of triggers could initiate a psychosis in just about anybody. On the other hand, someone hallucinating devils at the age of 14 or 15 may not be able to remember any specific triggers causing their first episode. So as opposed to people on the upper right, who usually have many triggers to their first acute psychosis, those on the lower left usually only have one or two, as it's the severity of the trauma that they've been through that is primarily responsible for their first episode. So, it's been a long journey, but a satisfying one, because I think I've finally got a pretty good answer to my question. If you remember from part 1, I started out looking for the difference between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder, but then in realizing that there was actually no definitive separation between a spiritual awakening or a spiritual emergency, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, I then asked what are the key factors which would lead to someone having a more positive, negative, or mixed episode of psychosis. And those key factors turned out to be consciousness and trauma. And knowing this, we can start to look at the spectrum of psychosis in a whole new way. You see, it's important to remember that up until now, according to psychiatry, all episodes of acute psychosis should be medicated, and most people become medicated for life. And that even among the most open-minded psychiatrists and psychologists, there's been a genuine frustration in the inability to clearly define a spiritual experience from insanity. However, what our model shows is that there will never be a clear diagnostic criteria to separate one experience from the other. And so rather than looking at these experiences in black and white terms of spiritual or insanity, we can now assess someone's probability of healing based on our model. And what we'll find is that for people approaching the upper right-hand side, there will be a high probability of having healing, even spiritual breakthroughs. Having much more fearful, traumatic experiences, those people in the lower left-hand side of the model will have a lower probability of healing, as it's much more difficult for those people to engage the material that they're confronted with. And as for people labeled with bipolar disorder, as always, they fall somewhere in the middle, usually having mixed episodes of love and fear. And for these people, their probability of healing can be good, provided that they're given the education and support necessary to help them work through their processes. Because in truth, wherever you would find yourself in this model, every acute psychosis has at least the potential of transforming into a spiritually healing experience. My new book, Am I Bipolar or Waking Up? By me, Sean Blackwell, is now available at Amazon.com. For more details, check out my new website at bipolarorwakingup.com.